Hey, this is Kerry K. Today's conversation is a supremely important one. There's a massive activation at the very end, so please do listen right there to the very last minute, because it's there, maybe it's the last 2-3 minutes that the activation really comes through. It's going to bring you into presence, into divine alignment, and give you the tools you need to navigate through this thing that I'm calling the great test. It is upon you right now. It is what you're navigating through right now, and it can be done seamlessly. Doesn't have to be as ominous as it sounds, the great test. It sounds like a scary thing, and truthfully it can be, but it's not designed to trip you up. It's actually designed to free you. Let's get into it. Here's a very important piece of information. Yesterday on YouTube I uploaded a video called The Great Unplugging. It's a super important one, and it's about how you're being unplugged from the old false matrix and restored to the true self, which is also called the divine matrix. Now, as this occurs, there is something you need to know, and that is that the ego is going to whip around and try to grab you and pull you back where it can thrive, pull you back where it thinks that it belongs and where it thinks that you belong, which is the old time matrix. Now, a lot of you will hear that and go, oh, I'm not going to let the ego do that. But the thing about the ego is that it never shows up wearing a name badge. It never has. It's only ever worn your name and your clothes, and much like an imposter, has shown itself as you in the world, paraded around as your truth, as your essence. The ego only wants life. This is built into every single thing, and that is the preservation of self, the preservation of life. The ego wants to continue life as it always has been, because to the ego's perspective, transformation isn't a thing. Transformation means the end of it. Transformation means, in its perception, the death of the ego. And it is this ego death that the ego fears the most. And it's a sneaky, tricky little bugger. So what it's going to do is it is going to pose as the you that has had injustice perpetrated against it. It's going to pose as grief. It's going to pose as sadness. It's going to pose as something external having happened to you. And all of your triggers are going to flare. And when you feel that happening, that is the great test. The great test. As you go through this test, I want you to recognize why it's happening. It's happening because you were once in an old matrix. You're now being released from it and restored to the truth of who you are. But the nature of the universe is that it's always going to check, is this your free will? Are you sure? Are you certain? Is this what you want? So it's going to give you this test, because it's kind of like saying you can go back if you want to. You can go back and carry on as it was. So here it is. Here's a dose of the ego, which feels comfortable and familiar, but hellish at the same time. Hellish because the ego is always in a state of trauma. It's always being prodded at and poked at, and it feels an incredible amount of suffering and struggle. Yet it's familiar, and humanity is notorious for mistaking familiarity for safety. So the ego is how the universe is going to present this test to you. The great test will come. And it will normally come in the form of some external person wronging you. But here's the thing, when it happens, there's a way to move through it really swiftly, and that is to get humble and to see through the eyes of truth. The ego cannot see through the eyes of truth. The ego can only see through its own distorted lenses. And the ego is going to make everything about itself. The ego can be in the presence of somebody else's dire wound, but it can't see the dire wound. It cannot. It cannot make somebody else feel whatever it is that they want. The ego becomes so selfish and so self-obsessed, and it says, what about me? What about me? Yeah, your leg is broken, but look there, I got a paper cut. That's the mentality of the ego. And the ego will pose as being very hard done by. The ego will pose as being very selfless and very giving, and often puts you in an unwitting state of martyrdom to prove how giving it has been. But that's not what true giving is. True giving is not your depletion. True giving is you feeling alive and feeling joy and thriving because you are filled and sharing the fullness of life. That is true giving. When you're giving from depletion, that's the ego embarking on duty and martyrdom and obligation. You see, it has so many sneaky avenues to trip you up. But remember I said there's an easy way to navigate through this, because there is. Number one, humility. Get humble. What is it that I'm not seeing? You can ask yourself that. What is it about the situation in front of me right now that I'm not seeing? Another important question. Who am I not seeing? Not just what am I, but who am I not seeing? And there's going to be two levels to that answer. The who am I not seeing? The first level is going to be, I am not seeing the situation clearly. I am not seeing perhaps the other person or their needs or whatever it might be. But the other thing is, I am not seeing me, because the ego cannot see itself. The nature of the ego is that if it were to truly introspect and self-reflect, it would transform. And remember, transformation is the opposite of what the ego wants. The ego wants preservation. So the ego only ever wants to stay in its unenlightenment. The ego only ever wants to stay in its not good enoughness, because then it has an avenue towards self-pity. Then it has an avenue towards having other people do things for it, because the ego is never powerful enough to do things for itself. Now, I know that this can be hard-hitting for some of you. And I know that this is going to be striking a chord for a number of you. And the purpose of putting out this video is not to put ego in your face and say, oh, look at you stuck in ego. Instead, for me to say to you, the ego is the great test. And each and every single one of you will walk through this great test, which is nothing more than confronting your own ego and all that it was attached to and all that it's trying to attach you to. Ego is always filled with attachments. There's something you need to know, and that is the ego was designed for you to carry out a life in the false matrix. That's how you did that, because you, in your essence, could never, ever have populated the false matrix. I want you to let that in. Listen to what I'm saying. Your true essence could never, ever have populated the false matrix, because if truth enters the false matrix ceases to be false. And the truth is so powerful that it begins just by its very presence to dissolve all that is untruth in its presence. So you had to have an avatar self. You had to have a player that could show up as you, so that you could have the experience of the false matrix. But the question is, why would you have done that? You would have done that as a being of high vibrational frequency and higher consciousness. You would have done that for a very important reason, and that is, if you elect to have a portion of the untruth, the false matrix, showing up as you, and if you were to purify that portion of you, because that's all you can do, you can only purify yourself. You cannot purify the world. You can purify yourself. And when you purify yourself, you become a recalibration. You become a living beacon of truth that automatically begins to dissolve the false matrix. This is what the great unplugging is based upon. It's based upon enough of us, enough of you, stepping into your truth powerfully enough to create glitches and cracks in the false matrix that allowed you to get unplugged in the first place. So, as you undertook to embody a part of the false matrix through the ego, because that's the part that allowed you to do this, you did it knowing that that was how you were going to purify the false matrix and restore the divine matrix. The divine matrix is pure truth. It is the universe in its pure, raw, creative, divine form. The ego is not special. Ego always wants to be special, but the ego is not special. You, however, are something far more than special. You are divine, and you are magnificent, and you are pure, and you are truth, and you are being restored to the pure truth of who you are. But you've got to let go of the idea that you're special in order to embody your divinity. So humility is based upon that. Humility is based upon you giving up, relinquishing that which kept you separate and special. Earlier, I said to you, ask these really important questions. What am I not seeing? Who am I not seeing? Here's another very powerful thing for you to ask. What is it that was keeping me separate and special in my separateness? Now, special in your separateness is whatever made you stand out in your pain. So was it the, oh, I'm not clever enough to get this? Was it the, everybody else is in a loving relationship, but I'm not? Anything that would have made your pain special or stand out more than somebody else's, this was the tool that the ego would have used to puff itself up, to inflate itself. Because ego is not a natural thing, and because it's not natural, it cannot evolve and it cannot expand. Only organic things evolve and expand. The ego is inorganic, it's not natural. And I'm saying this because somebody wrote in my comment section a little while ago, oh, the ego is created by God's source consciousness. It really is not. In the same way that the false matrix was not created by God's source consciousness. The ego is what facilitated your entry into the false matrix. So it was never bad. And you're not bad for having an ego. You needed the ego to give you an access point to the false matrix. But now, the role of the ego is pretty much done, isn't it? Because if you imagine, well, I don't need to navigate the false matrix anymore because now it's time for purification. Purification of the false matrix means purification of the false matrix within each and every single one of us. That's the test. That's the ego death. That's the ego purification that's occurring right now. That is what the great unplugging is based upon. It's based upon you no longer resorting to, returning to, or even answering to the ego. Instead, pursuing and seeking out that part of you that is beyond special, that part of you that is in divine union with life itself. What would you be like? Here's another great question. What would I be like if my divine self expressed itself today in this world through my words, through my mouth? What would it speak? What would it say? How would colors look if my divine self were witnessing the world? How would it see the events of the world if it were seeing through my eyes? And these kinds of questions allow for you to shift perspective, because there's another great tool that I want to give you, and that is, when you judge the ego, guess what you do? You perpetuate the ego. There's a very big trap there. It was a fail-safe that the ego used to maintain itself. The moment I'm spotted, I'm judged, because the ego is always sneaky and it always does things which are quite untoward and quite manipulative. So the ego says, well, even if I'm spotted and seen, I'm going to be judged. And the judgment of the ego perpetuates the ego and extends its life. There's a way for you to see it and neutralize it. And it's not through non-judgment. Instead, it's through something much higher than non-judgment. It's through an energy called divine neutrality, sacred neutrality. Another way of describing this would be to use the word acceptance. But here's what it looks like. If you could step into divine neutrality and allow yourself to witness your ego as it exists today, not with judgment, but from a very calm presence. And you might say, but how do I do that? How do I step into calm presence? Well, here's a great gift that's occurred in the unplugging. In the unplugging, right now, in this exact moment, I don't know if you've tuned in, but in case you haven't, you should. Because the air is effervescent and it's buzzing and it's alive and it's profoundly activated, and your ability to dial into presence and to dilate time and just immerse yourself there in a field of presence is something that you've never had before. So go in and experience yourself as presence. In presence. And when you do this, you will begin automatically the process of witnessing the ego self from divine neutrality. And the second that happens, you neutralize the ego. And then all the space that the ego once took up, which was a lot of space, all of that room, becomes occupied by the true self. The true self, you could say, returns, or really, it doesn't actually return. The truth is, you are restored to that connection. You can neutralize the ego by seeing through the eyes of divinity, which requires you to step into presence. And presence is unfolding right now like a blanket of energy, and it's wrapped itself around you right now. It's very real, tangible. Feel it. Go ahead. And just that begins the process of neutralizing the ego. So this great test is not such a big test after all. This great test is easily navigated when you understand the dynamics of the great test. So lots of love. Speak to me in the comment section. Let me know how you're navigating through this and if you've noticed the great test in your own life. Watch this video. I'm going to link it for you on YouTube. If you don't find it linked, check the video description box. Lots of love, everyone. Bye-bye for now.